Welcome back to the podcast. We got a new name now. It's the Train Smarter, Hunt Longer podcast. I'm Todd Bumgardner. If you're new, if you never listened before, it used to be called the Human Predator Pack Mule Podcast. Then it was the Pack Mule Podcast. Now it's Train Smarter, Hunt Longer. It happens to be our tag name. I think it flows a little bit better. I think it works a little bit better. So it's been a little bit since we've had an episode come out. June of 2025. We're back on a roll. And we're going to jump in with something I think is really important for hunters that is also just kind of it's popular right now, right? And that is zone 2 training. So I have a nice outline here for the podcast. It's going to be a solo episode. I'm going to walk through this, with you guys and walk you through pretty much everything you need to know about zone 2 as a hunter. One of the big issues is like, we know it's important. It's talked about all the time. You hear about the benefits, all of that kind of stuff. The problem is it's still really hard for hunters to do it because they don't like it. But here's the thing. I'm going to break it down for you. What it actually is, how to use it, how to progress it throughout the year and even beyond a year, and why it makes sense for us so much. So grab whatever you want to drink. I have myself a Coke Zero. I'm a big Coke Zero guy. Settle in and enjoy this. And I want you to keep in mind, if you've ever started a hunt, you just went uphill and you got wrecked immediately, heart rate jumped through the roof, couldn't recover, kind of took it out of you for the rest of the hunt, this episode is very much for you and you need to pay attention. So I think we need to start by defining what zone 2 actually is. And so it is the highest sustainable intensity with which your aerobic system is still predominantly producing energy. Okay, so just take a quick step back from just a little basic physiology so you can understand it. You have different energy systems. You have your anaerobic system, which breaks into lactic and alactic, and you have your aerobic system. All of your energy systems are functioning all the time. Duration of exercise and intensity of exercise determines which one is going to dominate. What we want to do is make a aerobic system that's so robust and so durable that it does the bulk of the work for us a lot of the time. That's our goal, okay? So zone 2, where does that fit in? It's defined in a handful of different ways. I'll start by saying the only way to truly know if you're in zone 2 is to blood test yourself while you're moving. Sucks, kind of painful. It's not that painful, but it's a pain in the ass. And it's incredibly cost prohibitive. So one time my business partner at the gym and I put ourselves through an experiment to kind of correlate our heart rates with what the actual blood lactate what our actual blood lactate readings were. And so we bought the kits, right? So like you get it looks like a strip for testing diabetes, almost testing your blood sugar for diabetes. And so you poke yourself, you go through it. This shit was expensive, and then like sitting there and pricking your damn finger while you're trying to train, absolute pain in the ass. So they say the way to know that you're in zone 2 by your blood lactate accumulation is if you're between 1.7, I think, and 2.0 millimoles of blood lactate, that's your zone 2. Okay. We're not going to do that. You're not going to do that. I'm not going to do that. The only time you're going to do that is if you're in a lab, or if you want to be like us and run a little experiment sometime, then sure, knock yourself out. But really what we're looking at is essentially your aerobic threshold and about 10% below that of, beats per minute of your heart rate. That's about your zone 2. A few different ways to find it. So a lot of folks will say, you could just use the 60 to 70% of your max heart rate. It doesn't really work that well because, first of all, let's say that somebody isn't very well trained. Their max heart rate might be really high. Like they go out and they do a max heart rate test, and let's say that their heart rate is 200, but they're out of shape. So if that's not indicative, right? So their zone 2 might actually be much lower than 70%, 60 to 70% of their max heart rate, right? So if they start training and they get up to 60 to 70% of their max heart rate, they might actually be in a higher heart rate zone. So that doesn't really work all that well for a lot of people. There is a simple equation that you can use if you don't have any way to measure, you haven't done any tests, and that is MAF, right? So MAF stands for maximum aerobic function, and it finds what's called your first aerobic threshold, or the top of your zone 2. At the top of your zone 2, your first aerobic threshold, that's where you start to shift from predominantly aerobic energy production to more of a split. That's where you get into zone 3, things start to even out. And then as you get towards the top of your zone 3, you shift more towards anaerobic energy production instead of aerobic. Okay? So your aerobic threshold, they say there's AET1 and AET2. So some people call your second one lactate threshold, but that's the top of your zone 3. The top of your zone 2 is AET1, or your aerobic threshold. Okay? So MAF figures out what your aerobic threshold is. Okay? You do the MAF equation by taking 180 minus your age. So if 180 minus your age, let's say that you're 30 years old, 180 minus your age is 150 beats per minute, right? So that would approximate the top of your zone 2. Now, there's different ways to play with this equation. If you've been training consistently for a few years with aerobic work, you can bump that up by a handful of beats, sometimes as much as 10 beats for some folks. So maybe it might be 155 for someone that's 30. However, if you haven't been training, one of the smartest things to do is to take that number and knock 5 to 10 beats off of it to set that as the top of your zone 2. Because if you haven't been training aerobically, you're not going to be as efficient, and you will start to shift more towards anaerobic energy production much faster than somebody that's been trained. Also the case, if you've been sick and you're coming back from training, you're going to take that number and knock it down. Okay? Another way to find the top of your zone 2 is to do an aerobic threshold test. So that's one of the tests that we do now with our backcountry ready folks, and we use it with our pack mule elite folks too. So essentially it's kind of like a step test. You walk up your intensity over the course of a given amount of time until your heart rate steadies and you find an average. Okay. I'm not going to walk through the exact tests here, but we have information on our website, and I'd be happy to answer any questions about it. So that's one way to find your aerobic threshold. We confirm that with a drift test. So later in the week, we'll do a cardiac drift test. And that is to determine, first of all, your aerobic durability. Like, does your aerobic system produce energy well over time? And then also to confirm if we have the right aerobic threshold set for somebody. So how that works is you warm up, you do 30 minutes. Once you warm up to a heart rate that's just under your proposed aerobic threshold. Okay, once you hit that, your heart rate steadies, you go for 30 minutes. Okay, you maintain the same pace. So let's say if you're on a treadmill, let's say you have the incline set to 10 degrees and you're walking at a 3 mile per hour pace. You will maintain that 3 mile per hour pace once you hit it, if that's where your heart rate steadies. 30 minutes, start the clock, take the average of that 30 minutes. As soon as you finish those 30 minutes, you start the clock for another 30 minutes. Same exact pace. What we look at is the heart rate average between the first 30 minutes and the second 30 minutes. If the difference is between 3 to 5%, that was a good heart rate, a good aerobic threshold for you, right? That's about where your aerobic threshold should be. And then it also, if you're towards the 5% end of the spectrum, you're not quite as aerobically durable as you could be. We want to see you closer down to the 3% end of the spectrum. Now, if you're under 3%, it means that you likely didn't go hard enough, or your aerobic threshold might actually be higher. Now, if you're above 5%, if there's more than a 5% difference, you probably went too hard, or your aerobic threshold was set too high. Okay. A lot of times you look at that, and it's typically that someone set their aerobic threshold too high and they need to back it back down. Okay, so that's another way that we use to find someone's zone 2. So let's say that the calculation was correct. We'll say that someone's aerobic threshold was 140. Okay, now how do we find the bottom of the zone 2? So the simple way to do that is just take 10% and knock it off, and that'll be the bottom. So if it's 140, 10% of that would be 14. Knock that off, you're down to 126. And so your zone 2 would be 126 to 140. And then if you take 20%, you find the bottom of your zone 1. So minus 28. So what's that put you at? 20 would be 120 8 more. So it'd be 112 to 126 would be your zone 1. Okay. So that's an easy way to find it. Now you have to do the tests, obviously, but that's a pretty simple way to find it. Now, the thing to keep in mind about training zones and training intensities is that they're moving targets. So that's an approximation. Your zone 2 on one day could be different than the other based on recovery status, based on your hydration, based on stress, based on elevation. All of these affect your zone 2. These are approximations of moving targets that allow us to train. You might have to make adjustments from day to day, but your zone 2 is essentially the highest rate of work, highest sustainable intensity, where your aerobic energy, your movement is primarily fueled by your aerobic system. Okay. Other way to find it, you can use respiration. Okay. So if you can say a full sentence before you need to take a deep breath, you should be in zone 2. And that's another way to kind of check it from day to day. So let's say you set it at 140, and you go to train, you start getting up towards the edge of 140, but you're having a hard time doing that talk test, right? Like you can't get a full sentence out. Well, you probably need to adjust your zones down for whatever reason that day, because you're probably going to be training outside of zone 2 if you continue to just go by that number, right? A number gives us an aiming point, an approximation, and we have to be smart and move it from day to day based on what's going on. Then we have to think about, like, so why is zone 2 training important for us? Well, there's a lot of reasons. First, we want to use fat for fuel as much as we possibly can. We have way more of it. It generates energy for longer, and it also is our recovery system. So your aerobic system is your recovery system. So let's say you have a really hard day 1 of a hunt. Okay. Lots of hiking in, lots of elevation gain. Not too bad, but it kind of kicks your ass a little bit. If you don't develop your aerobic system to the point that you need to, you won't recover from that day as well as you could, right? Because your aerobic system is your recovery system. Not only does it build the highway, so from a heart perspective, from a local, we call local your like central adaptation, so your heart being able to pump out more blood with each beat, but also your vasculature, it increases your capillary density, which is increases the amount of surface area that you have to transfer oxygen and nutrients to your muscles. So that's super important. We need that. And it also helps you better regulate your nervous system, right? So if you have a good aerobic system, the cardiac adaptations that you get from that directly influence your autonomic nervous system, because we'll just call it a direct line between your vagus nerve and your heart. So the better your heart functions, the better your vagal tone, which makes it easier to flip from fight or flight mode to rest and digest mode. Okay, so fight or flight is sympathetic tone, rest and digest is parasympathetic tone. We want to live more towards the parasympathetic tone end of things. And also, if you develop your aerobic system really well, you don't get into sympathetic tone quite so much, even when you're training. Okay, so it's really important for our recovery, but also it keeps you from having to burn carbs too much and utilize, your fast twitch muscles and everything that just makes work much, much harder when you're hunting, you're hiking, you're running, all of that kind of stuff. It's just the basis of developing your endurance is developing your aerobic system. Okay. Because it allows you to go for longer, allows you to go farther, and allows you to recover better. So that's why it's really, really important for us. It just increases everything about your endurance metabolism a lot better. Now, another thing that it's going to be really important for us is it's actually going to support the heavier and harder training that we need to do. So like I said before, it builds the highways, right? So if you need to do more intense training to like push that lactate threshold that I was talking about, which is important for us to be able to manage intensity and recover, whether it's hard uphills, whatever it might be, muscular endurance work, all of that kind of stuff. Building the highway first allows you to get more out of that training because you have the delivery system. You can get oxygen and nutrients and things like that to your muscles much faster, while also recycling the products from that training. So lactate, things like that, much faster because you have the capillary density, your heart's working better, all of that kind of stuff. So it'll help you recover within the session faster. Well, it'll actually help you get more out of the session because you'll be able to work harder. but also it'll help you recover between intervals, and it'll help you recover between sets better, between training sessions better. And so we need it to support the heavier and harder training that we need to do. Without it, you won't get as much out of those training sessions. So let's say, for example, you're doing some kind of lactate threshold work. So typically that's about 8 to 15 minutes of hard work. We'll call at about a 7 to 8 RPE for most people. You do that work. If you don't have the aerobic system you need, you might get one interval in, try to recover after that interval, and be totally shot and not be able to get into the second interval. So you won't be able to accrue as much volume. And then it'll wipe you out more. And so maybe you do that, and then you're supposed to do an easy training day the next day, or you're supposed to train again in 2 days, but you're still recovering from that session because you didn't have the resource delivery and allocation system built that you needed. And so if you don't do the zone 1 and the zone 2 work that you need to do, then you won't be able to get as much out of your intense training. So, one of the things that you look at too from all of this is from a longevity standpoint on a single hunt, right? So a lot of times what you see is you'll see a guy go out on day 1. It'll be hard. He'll get through it. It won't be too bad. He gets up on day 2. He's not too bad. Pushes through day 2. And then he gets to day 3 and he's shot. And he doesn't have any gas left. He feels like shit. He's beat up, all of that kind of stuff. And that's because he likely, first of all, he might not have trained nearly as much as he should have, but it also might be the case that he just did a lot of really hard sessions because he felt like a hunt was hard last time. So he feel like he needed to replicate that, which is what a lot of training is based on. Unfortunately, it's not about building. They don't build raw materials. They just throw you into things that feel hard, and it doesn't really work. But he didn't have the recovery system built. And so if you want to be able to go from day to day to day, there's 2 things. You have to develop your aerobic system so that each day costs you less. You're reliant more on fat for movement, which isn't, it takes longer to use, but it doesn't take as much out of you metabolically. And then also, you will be able to recover better between days or even on breaks. Those 2 factors make it easier for you to go from day to day to day during a hunt, recover, and keep going. And that's why you see guys go out and do 10 to 15 day backpack hunts and still feel fine and still feel like they could go as well as they could on day 1 on day 15. And it's because they had the conditioning base, the aerobic base laid that they needed to lay to be able to do that. So when you're in zone 2, you're primarily using fat for fuel, but you're still burning carbohydrates too. It's just you're tilted towards fat. So it's going to be somewhere between typically 60 to 80% of your fuel, depending on the day, depending on what else is going on, is going to come from fat when you're in zone 2. As you start to get into zone 3, it starts to tilt more even and then starts to shift more towards burning carbs instead of fat. Okay. So we know what zone 2 is. We know what it does for us. What do we need to do to be able to train it? So there's a lot of different ways, right? And it depends on where you're at throughout the year. The first thing is you need to accrue volume. And if you're new to zone 2, you're going to get a lot out of shorter sessions and just accruing volume across the training week and across the training month. You need to do at least a 30-minute session to be able to get the adaptations. If you're not doing at least a 30-minute session, you won't get the cardiac adaptations you need because we need the blood coming back to the heart, stretches the left ventricle, makes it contract harder so that it can push out more blood with each beat. It takes about 30 minutes to get that adaptation. And then just from a teaching your body to be effective and efficient at burning fat for fuel, you have to stay at the right intensity for an extended period of time. So if you're new to it, 30-minute sessions, 45-minute sessions, and starting to accrue a time is huge. We want to see about 2 total hours. Obviously, if you're brand new, you'll get a training of effect from even less than that. But we want to see it like a minimum of 2 hours. So that'd be 4 30-minute sessions per week, or an hour session, 30-minute session, and another 30-minute session. That's a good place to start. We don't want to push to the point where you're just super duper fatigued from one session, especially when you're starting. Okay, so you can push to the point where you start to feel like your legs get heavy, but other than that, you still feel pretty good. That's a good place to be when you're first starting out. But if anything else, just accruing those 30-minute sessions, because that gets you into the zone long enough, and then you'll start to build the adaptations. Now, as you get going, you're going to need longer sessions, because we have to get to the point where we really train our body to be even more efficient at using fat for fuel, and then stabilizing that and making it durable, right? And the only way to do that is to continue to stay in the zone for longer, because then we start to force the adaptation of getting efficient at using fat for fuel. We have to stress it. Now, the thing about this is like, it's not necessarily going to feel hard, but we have to induce enough stress to be able to make the body adapt to start to use fat for fuel for longer, and then stabilize heart rate so it still can do that. Otherwise, that's where you see, when someone does a cardiac drift test, you start to see that cardiac drift because they have to start switching fuel sources much faster. If you're aerobically fit, you can stay on one fuel source for longer. So as you start to get into it, you're going to have to start building longer sessions. Now, and then if you look at what we do as hunters, it just becomes more specific anyway, right? Because we have days where we have to hike all day, we have to do all that, so we have to be able to move all day. Specific in that way, but we also need to be able to do it to train our aerobic system to go for longer. So we know the upper echelon of, where you still get any kind of physiological benefit is somewhere between like 3 or 4 hours. After that, it's more about just training yourself mentally and fueling and things like that. For most folks, hitting sessions between 60 and 90 minutes after they've started to accrue volume and all that kind of stuff is a good place to be. As you move on, doing some 2-hour sessions, doing some 3-hour sessions, things like that are going to be beneficial, especially as you get closer to summer. So that's a really good way to start, and that's a really good simple way to start progressing it. If you're looking throughout the week, it might look like, a couple of 45-minute sessions, a 60-minute session, a 45-minute session, and then a longer, 75 to 90-minute session on the weekends is a good place to be. And this is all dependent on what else is going on in your training program. So like, I'm recording this in the end of January, right? So right now, all of our conditioning is in zone 1 and zone 2. We need a long runway. We need to build that base so we can support the harder work that we're going to do later, and to be able to recover from it, but also to be able to have the runway built for it. And then also to be able to handle the longer sessions that we'll do as we get into the summer. So we have to create that durability now that's going to carry forward so we can do longer sessions without the drift while still training our aerobic system the way that we want to as we progress, towards hunting season. So it's a really good way to start, really simple way to break into it, but you have to do sessions that are at least 30 minutes. So, what should you do for these sessions? And really what it depends on is the time of year. Right now, it can be pretty general. You can get on the bike, you can do incline treadmill work, you can jog, you can swim, you can hike, you can do all of that kind of stuff this time of year. The big thing to keep in mind though, is your zones also change based on your position, right? So your standing aerobic threshold is going to be different than your seated aerobic threshold, just because the blood pressure changes because of how much of you is in gravity. So if you're doing seated exercise, whether it's the bike or it's the rower or something like that, you're going to drop your heart rate by about 5 beats per minute on average. So if we set the top of your zone 2, your aerobic threshold at 140, you're going to back it down to like 135, something like that. And then, if you did, let's say you did your drift test or your aerobic threshold test at seated and it was 135 there, then if you're going to standing, you'd walk it up to 145. Now, this time of year, you just need to accrue volume. Is it good to do some of the specific work early this time of year? Absolutely. So getting on the incline treadmill, hiking, things like that at a controlled pace is a really good idea. Now, I know that like getting on the incline treadmill, getting on the stair climber, all these kind of things can be really boring. But here's the thing about it. I like that kind of work this time of year because it allows you to control your pace, your heart rate in a much easier way. So you can stay steadily in the zone rather than seeing big climbs and changes in your heart rate and having an average in zone 2. you can find close to that aerobic threshold and just stay there and hang out much easier without having to worry about modifying your intensity, slowing down, speeding up, all of that kind of things. I really like that. Now, it's also fine to get out and hike and do all that kind of stuff and accrue volume. You just have to kind of pay attention to your pacing and all of that. So this time of year, really general work is good, but definitely continue to mix in specific work. Now, truth be told, I'm doing most of my my zone 2 work right now on the incline treadmill and with some running. So I'm staying relatively specific. The one thing that I'm not adding yet is weight. As you get closer to the summer, it's going to be important from a muscular endurance standpoint and a specific standpoint for just being efficient under load to start adding weight into the equation. Now, right now, depending on where your fitness is, you could be just rucking on flat ground too, but here's the thing is like, once you get efficient with rucking, it's, especially on flat ground, it's really difficult for people to get into zone 2 and maintain that. They end up staying in zone 1 more than zone 2. And so that's where we start to, when we see people smoke our 3-mile rucking assessment, when they smoke that, we know that it's time for them to start switching their means. They either have to get on some kind of an incline or they have to run or something like that to continue their zone 2 development. Otherwise, they're just not going to get enough stress to really build that and continue on. So all of those things are in play. Now, as we move closer to season, we want to start doing some stuff under load. So we want to do loaded hiking. We want to do which incline treadmill and stair climber count as that, because it's going to help build the muscular endurance for uphills and also just the specific things that we need to be able to fuel ourselves as we move through to the season, right? To get the specific fueling of moving efficiently under load while staying as aerobic as possible. And so right now you want to see like most of your volume in zone 2. Now, if you have a lot of experience, are really aerobic developed, you can kind of shift that and make it like, you can start to add more intense work in. We'll do that in phase 2 for our folks that are really well developed aerobically. But for most people, just kind of living in zone 2 right now is a good thing. One of the things that we'll test that I test for myself as well is the difference between the top of your zone 2 and the top of your zone 3. So if your zone 3 starts to shrink because your zone 2 creeps up, that's a good indication that you can start to add more intense work into your training, and that more intense work is actually going to help you move forward. That's something that I learned from the folks at Uphill Athlete and Evoke and stuff like that. There's not research for this. This is just a practical application based on the things that they've learned working with mountaineers and ultra runners and things like that over the years. So they say, when there's only a 10% gap between the top of your zone 2 and the top of your zone 3, that's when you're really ready to start adding more intense training is. Because the last thing you want to do before your zone 2 and your aerobic system is really well developed is continue to push your lactate threshold higher while your zone 2 stays down here. Because then you have, you'll start to shift more towards anaerobic energy production too early. I think for us, for our purposes, I think under 15 but closer to 10% gap is pretty good, and you can start to benefit from more and handle more intense training. But that's one of the ways that we'll look at as we start testing towards the end of this training block and moving into more of our intense training. So how many hours per week? The easiest way to think about that is if you're really getting serious about it, somewhere between 3 to 5 hours is going to be the best. And then like if you have like a really long expedition type hunt, as the year gets on, getting close into that 4 hour or maybe even closer to 6 hour per week mark is going to be good for you. You don't have to be an ultra runner. You don't have to be some extreme endurance athlete or anything like that. Even if you're hitting 3 to 5 hours per week and one of those sessions is long, that's going to be really good. Now, here's the thing. If you have a choice, if you have to make a choice, right? So throughout your week, you can't get long sessions in, whatever it be. I would sincerely, if you've accrued enough work throughout your training career, let's say you go for a handful of months, hitting 30-minute sessions, 4 or 5 of them a week, and you've got all that volume. Now, I mean, if you had to make a choice and you only had time to do one thing, I would do one long aerobic session, then worrying about trying to continue to break them up throughout the week. because you're going to get more out of staying in the zone for longer by making yourself more efficient at using fat for fuel over a longer period of time, so you don't have that drift that we were talking about, so you can continue to keep your heart rate low and rely mostly on fat for fuel for an extended period of time. So so you're going to want to accrue volume and then start to work into longer sessions. You can start general, and a lot of the year you can be relatively general, but as we get closer to hunting season, you want to be more specific, getting more under load, getting more uphill work in, that kind of stuff. And then as you get into hunting season, depending on the kind of hunting that you're doing, that might be a lot of your conditioning, and you might not need as much of it. Maybe just some maintenance stuff, 30 to 45 minute sessions to recover, while most of your work is coming from your actual hunting. And then you can go back to general means and stuff like that as we get into that. So that's a really good way to define it, progress it, understand what you need, and understand how it applies to us, to hunters. One of the things that I see that are big mistakes is people, when they start to ruck, they wear a pack that's too heavy for doing zone 2 because they're trying to force their way into the zone. We still want to train mostly around 20 to 25% of our body weight with our pack most of the time. Now, there's going to be times when you can go heavier and should go heavier. Like when we do high intensity continuous training, our packs be heavier, but that's not necessarily, it's not a zone 2 means. It is to develop our fast twitch muscles in an aerobic way, but it's not necessarily that. Now, and there are also muscular endurance type training that you would put a heavier pack on. I know like the Evoke endurance guys, like the ones that won the Western States ultra marathon this year, they did uphill work with up to like 40% of their body weight. But here's the thing, you have to keep in mind, those folks aren't super heavy. That if you're a upper towards 200 pound type person, rucking with that kind of weight consistently is going to take a bigger toll on you. And also you have to keep in mind that you need to earn your way up to that. And so most of that earning is done by staying around 20%, maybe 25% of your body weight most of the time, and getting efficient under load so you don't make bad habits. Because if you're constantly using weight that's too heavy, your gait's going to change too much, your breathing patterns are going to change too much, and you're just going to create bad habits that make you inefficient. So that's something to very much keep in mind. Another thing is people set their zone 2 way too damn high all the time. And they're not actually in zone 2 anymore. They start to creep up into zone 3. And so if anything, be conservative with it and take it maybe a little lower than you think you might need to, especially if you haven't tested. So like if you haven't been training and you're just going to use the MAF equation, use MAF and then knock a handful of beats off that until you really start to see your work rate improve at that heart rate. So if you see yourself getting faster, but your heart rate's not going up, then okay, maybe it's time to test this again, or I can adjust it up. But looking at your output is a very, very big way to do that. So that's a really good guide to zone 2 training for hunters. A lot of general means now. Zone 2 is, I'm gonna recap. We're gonna do a recap here. Zone 2 is the fastest sustainable pace where you can still produce energy aerobically. Your zone 2 is your aerobic threshold to about 10% below your aerobic threshold. And then your zone 1 is 20% below your aerobic threshold, up to 10% below your aerobic threshold. We want to live in these zones because they develop our aerobic system, both structurally and metabolically, so that we're more efficient at using fat for fuel when we move, but also that we recover better after exercise, between bouts of exercise, and in general, right? It just makes us way more efficient. So that way we can rely more on fat for fuel out on our excursions, which makes each day easier, but also helps us recover better between each day so that we can take a long hunt and enjoy it, honestly, enjoy it, and be able to go from day to day and feel like we still have the same capacity that we would have. I think that's a really good place to go. So what you need to do now, if you're listening to this and you haven't done it, is like figure out where your zone 2 is, the top of your zone 2 is. Look at where your volume is right now. Like if you're not in 2 hours per week, like make the goal to get up to 2 hours per week. As you do that, start to accrue more and start to work in longer sessions. They can be general right now. And then as you get closer to hunting season, they need to be far more specific. Okay. So I think that's the ultimate guide for zone 2 for hunters. Now, I could have got into way more technical science and stuff like that. And if you want that, let me know. And I can do an episode that talks way more about technical shit. But this is the ultimate, I guess we'll call it the ultimate practical guide of zone 2 for hunters. So I want you to use this information, go out, start getting your work in, getting at least 30 minutes in, start to build up the volume, start to get in longer sessions, go from general to specific. And then as you start to see your output in zone 2 increase, or if you do a threshold test and you see that the gap between your the top of your zone 3 and the top of your zone 2 is shrinking, it might be time to add in some more intense work depending on what you're doing, what you need, and where you're at. And you can cycle this for the rest of your life and continue to make progress. So yeah, that's a really good start, really good guide for zone 2 for hunters. If you have questions, make sure you send them in to me, todd@humanpredatorpackmule.com. This episode was also based on a bunch of questions that I've been getting about zone 2. So it's essentially kind of a Q&A episode. So if you have questions you want answered, I will absolutely record podcasts for you to answer your questions. So send them in to todd@humanpredatorpackmule.com. I appreciate you listening, and we are going to be back to regular episodes here on the Train Smarter, Hunt Longer podcast. Thanks for listening, guys.